Before I start, I want to thank each and every one of you as American Armenians who accomplished something that we wanted to accomplish for many, many years. I'm sure you all had your little or big contribution to having this decision passed last week. But also, between you and I, we should also thank Erdogan for doing everything that he can in order to convince the American congressmen and women to pass this resolution. So, I'm hoping that everybody understands English. Otherwise, if not, I will also speak in Armenian, but if everybody understands English, let's go English, and then the questions you can ask in English, Armenian, Turkish, Kurdish, your choice. I wrote this book last year, but it's the culmination of more than 60 articles that I have written over the past 8 years or so, explaining a new reality, which is the hidden Armenians. The book has also history and our own personal family history, etc., a few other articles, but mainly it's about hidden Armenians. Who are hidden Armenians? Let's start with that. In 1915, with the genocide, as the bulk of Armenian population was driven out and murdered, thousands of orphans were left behind in Turkey. And the government organized orphanages where these Armenian orphans were forcibly Islamized, given Turkish names, and they were strictly forbidden to speak Armenian, beaten up when they were heard speaking Armenian, and eventually thousands upon thousands of these boys and girls were kept in these orphanages. There were a few, of course, rescued ones, but most of them were kept in Turkey, and they became Turkified and Islamized. There were also, only just to give you an example, under the Eastern Army Command, the Eastern Commander Kazım Karabekir, in the territories that he controlled, there were 60,000 Armenian orphans. He took the most fit and healthy ones, the boys, and he trained them as Turkish soldiers in Turkish military schools. And in Turkish, they were called Gürbüzler Ordusu, which means the army of the healthy. And they were trained as soldiers and devoid of motherly, parental love and affection. These boys became ruthless soldiers of the Turkish army. But the worst happened to the Armenian girl orphans. Slave markets were abolished in Turkey in 1908. They were reopened in 1915, and these girls were, after being tattooed on their foreheads and wrists, they were sold as slaves for the price of a lamb. But girls coming from wealthy families, they fetched a much higher price because whoever took this girl also became the owner of the possessions of the properties of this girl. And these girls became either an adopted daughter, a servant, a farm worker, or a second wife, third wife, or a mistress in these Turkish and Kurdish families. Now, as I said, these boys and girls, orphans, became the living victims of the genocide. In order for you to understand what living victims means, I will give you an example. Imagine a girl playing in her Armenian village with her brothers, sisters, with other Armenian kids, and suddenly Turkish soldiers come, they murder her parents, and they become her new parents. So the murderer becomes her new parent. She is forced to live in the house that her own parents built, and the murderers live in that house. They raise her as a Turk, give her a Turkish name, and then they marry her to another Turkish person. She has kids and grandchildren, but she is always remembering that she was Armenian. So this is like life in hell, and this is the story of this lady called Fethiye Çetin. She is one of the most prominent lawyers in Turkey. She was Hrant Dink's lawyer before he was shot, and she's the family lawyer for Hrant Dink's family ever since. And she was an orphan girl. Her grandmother was an orphan girl in Elazığ area, Harput area. And her grandmother, kept her Armenian origin as a secret until Fethiye graduated and became a well-known lawyer. At that time, she told her secret to Fethiye and asked her to find her sister. She somehow knows that one of her sisters was rescued and taken to the States. So Fethiye, just like a detective, tried to find the traces of her grandmother's sister. Eventually, she found her grandmother's sister in New Jersey area, in the States. And unfortunately, by this time, her grandmother had passed away. So she wrote this whole thing as a book called My Grandmother, which is now translated into many languages. And this story became so well known in Turkey that several other people started coming forward saying that our grandmother or our grandfather are also Armenian. And then therefore a second book was written called The Grandchildren. So these events took place in the last 10 years or so. But whatever was left behind were not only the orphans in Turkey after the genocide. There were also more than 2,500 Armenian churches, more than 800 schools were left behind in Turkey. And most of them were either burnt and demolished outright in 1915, or the ones which were left standing, they were converted to other uses by the Turkish government, Turkish organizations such as schools, mosques, government buildings, banks, banquet halls, gymnasiums, even a whorehouse, one of the churches. So the largest of these churches was in Diyarbakır, called Surp Giragos Church. This church had a capacity of 3,000 people. Imagine the community in Diyarbakır at that time, before 1915. And as the Armenian population was driven out in 1915, this church became the army headquarters. And the German officers attached to the Ottoman army, with cannon shots, they took down the bell tower of the church on the pretext that a bell tower, a Christian bell tower, shouldn't be any higher than area mosques, minarets. So this church was taken over by the state and used as a warehouse, and with the Armenian community dwindling to very few people, it started to decay, and it was like this until 2011. By that time, a few friends, including my dear wife's brother in Istanbul, myself and a few others, organized the reconstruction of this church. And within 2 years, with fundraising from worldwide Armenian communities, as well as from within Turkey, Armenian communities, a miracle happened, and this church was reconstructed, and the opening night there were 4,000 people attending the consecration of the church. Most of these people didn't look Armenian. Of course, there were invited people from Istanbul, Armenians, from Armenia, from diaspora, but most of them seemed to be Muslim, Turkish-looking people. Ladies with covered scarves, men wearing typical Turkish or Kurdish dresses. And it turned out that these people are the descendants of Armenian orphans. They were aware of their Armenian roots, but they were keeping it secret. This church gave them the courage to come out and to start searching for their Armenian roots. I should tell you that in Turkey, Armenians are, of course, discriminated against. They're harassed in Istanbul, and being an Armenian in Anatolia, outside Istanbul, is even worse. And these hidden Armenians kept it as a secret because they were afraid of losing their jobs, their livelihood, or worse. So, but this church gave them the courage to come out and try to get organized. And you will soon see, this is the final church after it's constructed. And they got organized, but every time we organized, let's say, Easter get-together or Christmas get-togethers, more people showed up than what was anticipated. First year, there were only 300 çöreks made, and almost 600 people showed up. Next year, there were 600 çöreks made, 1,100 people showed up. So this thing started not only attracting hidden Armenians from Diyarbakır area, but also from surrounding regions, like all the way from Van, Urfa, Antep, Malatya. All these people started coming to this church. The church acted as a magnet for these hidden Armenians to get together. There were monthly breakfast meetings organized, and also with the local Diyarbakır municipality cooperation, Armenian lessons started, language classes. Even though on paper there is only one Armenian elderly couple living in Diyarbakır, these lessons attracted people. So I should say that after the opening the next year, during that trip that was mentioned, I gave a piano concert in the church, first concert since 1915. And the fundraising was used to pay for the bell tower. And in 2015, during the genocide commemoration, centennial commemoration, again thanks to friendly Kurdish municipality, as well as all these presence of these hidden Armenians, it was also commemorated in Diyarbakır. And I gave the night of 23 April 2015 another concert, only playing Gomidas, Khachadurian, Armenian composers, and more than 1,000 people attended, almost all of them hidden Armenians. And as I said, we organized Armenian language classes. And in order to reward them, I took the graduates of this Armenian language class to Armenia, as that was the first trip of hidden Armenians traveling to Armenia. The government of Armenia was very welcoming. Also, the people of Armenia were very interested in these hidden Armenians. And for these hidden Armenians, it was like finding their roots. We visited several cultural and historic sites, like this one, Sardar. But every morning, before riding the buses, there were Armenian language classes continued for them. And I should say that these trips, there were a few of them. First one was only from Diyarbakir, but the rest were from different regions of Turkey, from, as I said, Van, Urfa, Sasun, as well as from Hemşin area. Hemşin area is the northeast of Turkey on the Black Sea coast. These people are also originally Armenian, but they were converted to Islam several centuries ago, starting 15th, 16th century. And the government had brainwashed them in such a way that they didn't know that they were Armenian. They were told that they come from Central Asia. Interestingly, they still speak a dialect of Armenian. If you go to that Hemşin area, you will understand their language as Armenians. But they are told through the education system that this language is a branch of Turkish from Central Asia. And they didn't know until 20-25 years ago that their roots were Armenian. And most of them were nationalistically very racist and fascistically Turkish. I have heard with my own ears a lady telling me, yes, Hayçim, yes, Turkim, but she's telling me this in Armenian. So in the last 20 years, there's a big now movement, and they're trying to keep the Armenian Hemşin language, starting to get organized to teach them to their kids, etc. So there were people from Hemşin as well in this Armenian trip. And funnily enough, they told the teacher from Yerevan, Armenia, you step aside and we're going to teach Armenian to the rest of the group. These people ranged in age from 9 years old to 84 years old, that gentleman. And there were several types of people, engineers, doctors, lawyers, businessmen, retired people, teachers, housewives, all sorts of people. Their only common thing was that they all knew that their parents or grandparents were Armenian, and they wanted to return to Armenian roots, language, culture again. And in a few places, there are a lot of stories from each one of these persons. It can be a book for each of them. I'll just tell one instance. This boy is called Selim. He's from Sasun. And he also came in the first trip with us to Armenia, and he wanted to continue his education in Armenia. So I arranged with the government to give him a scholarship so that he can continue his education, his graduate studies in Yerevan. And his family had given him one letter written in Armenian, which was sent to Sasun in 1950s. and apparently they had some relatives in Armenia. So with that letter, Selim and I and a few others, we tried to find his long-lost relatives in Yerevan. And thankfully, their relatives were found, one of them, and within an hour and a half, from all different regions of Armenia, 42 people showed up in a small apartment, all welcoming Selim to Armenia and the long-lost relative. And the name Selim became Sevak, of course, and Selim stayed in Yerevan to continue his education. The first year was only learning language, and he learned Armenian so well that in the following year's trip, the Armenian government assigned him as an official guide to our group. These are the guides, one of them being Selim. And as I said, people were trying to find their Armenian roots, language and culture, but in some cases, they also wanted to return back to Christianity. I should tell you that in Muslim religion, abandoning Muslim religion is punishable by death. Especially in rural areas, in villages, that's the case. And if you give up on Islam, that's an even worse sin than leaving being Turkish and returning to Armenian roots. But the man wanted to return to his Christianity as well. He knew that his grandfather, named Stepan, was Armenian, and he wanted to take the name Stepan by becoming a Christian Armenian. So I arranged in Echmiadzin for him to be baptized. But there was also another lady who was a retired teacher, and she also wanted to return to Christianity because her father had confessed that they are Armenian, and just before his death, he had asked his daughter to also become Christian. But this lady is married to a very religious, highly Islamic Kurdish person, and he had told her that if you ever think of converting to Christianity, don't even bother coming back from Armenia. So she was between a hard place and a rock. But the last day, just before we were going to Echmiadzin, she said that I will also become Christian. And I said, are you sure? And she said, my father suffered all his life. If I'm going to suffer from now on because of my husband, I'm prepared. So instead of one, we had 2 christenings in Echmiadzin. You may recognize the clergyman. He was the Canadian diocese head, Pakrad Serbazan. So he baptized both Stepan and Angel. I should tell you that the man is a teacher in a Turkish state school. In order to have a job in the public sector in Turkey, you must be Islam. You cannot even be the lowest job, let's say, not lowest, but a garbage man cannot be hired if he's not Islam. But he took the risk and he became Christian. And naturally, when he went back to Diyarbakir, unfortunately, he was fired. He lost his job as a teacher. But thankfully, after a year of being unemployed, he found another teaching job in a private school. So this is the ceremony. And these hidden Armenian trips to Armenia became more and more organized, and eventually I called these activities Project Rebirth. And thanks to Facebook, social media, people started to get in touch not only with me but with one another. And in Dersim, there was huge movement. In Dersim, they were not converted to Islam, but they adopted the Alevi religion because that's the majority in that area. So there were hundreds upon hundreds of villages which had Armenian roots, but in appearance Kurdish or Turkish people. I organized another trip from Dersim to Armenia for 15 persons, but the significance of this is that all 15 were elected officials of Dersim villages. So these people were explaining that their village is full of hidden Armenians. Mush is another area where hidden Armenians started coming out. And Hamshen area also, Armenians are getting organized. So all these people now, we have formed a vast network in touch with one another, and they are in touch with one another. And I should tell you that a man from Hamshen ended up marrying a woman from Diyarbakir after one of these trips. Both of them hidden Armenian roots. This was our visit to the genocide memorial. Unfortunately, all of these promising good things came to an end in 2015, in June elections. If you can take a look at the map, the green areas are the provinces where the pro-Kurdish party won majority. And the yellow is Erdogan's party. If you notice, with the green areas are all the border areas, and Ankara government lost control with the borders with half of Georgia, Armenia, Iran, Iraq, and half of Syria. So this caused a lot of tension in Ankara. Also, the Kurds started demanding more local autonomy and other rights. And the central government's response was complete destruction and oppression of Kurds. Army moved into these green areas, and not only the Kurdish militants, but also the local population suffered because of this, including the hidden Armenians. I should say that the hidden Armenians are living in these green areas. Former historic Armenia, basically. Some pictures from the army moving in. This is downtown Diyarbakir. And it became like this. Now, these pictures are not from Syria or Iraq. This is right in Turkey. This civil war took place for 2 years. And there was a lot of suffering and destruction, including our Subgiragos church in Diyarbakir. Before I talk about Subgiragos, I should say that the discrimination and hatred toward Armenians is so much that two Turks, when they are fighting one another, as a swear word, they use the word Armenian. And they call Armenian bastard. And this is what's written on the wall here, Ermeni piçleri, which means Armenian bastards. This is what they are calling the Kurds. This is written by the Turkish Special Police. And Diyarbakir was a scene for official war almost, and the historic narrow streets of Diyarbakir were demolished because the tanks couldn't move in those narrow streets. So many houses and shops in those narrow streets were demolished. People were thrown out, and there were vast open areas created around Suk Giragos Church. Suk Giragos Church was nationalized, taken over by the Turkish state, and was converted to police and army headquarters again. History repeating itself, 100 years later, Suk Giragos Church became a police headquarters. The Armenian Foundation, looking after the Suk Giragos Church, immediately took the central government to court to reverse the legislation of nationalization. And the government had nationalized or expropriated not only the church, but also more than 200 properties belonging to the church. So within a year or so, those legislations were overruled, and thankfully now the church also again belongs to Armenian Foundation, connected to the Istanbul Patriarchate, Istanbul Church. And the church didn't suffer much structurally, but the policemen and the soldiers living in the church during the war, they destroyed a lot of the altars. They plundered, looted. They put the pews against the windows as protection against the Kurds. And they slept in the church, as I said. And even though there is a washroom in the church, they use the altar as the washroom. But I'm happy to tell you that the war is now finished, and the Armenian Foundation, and through different channels, both from outside, through me, to consulates, as well as from inside, my wife's brother, we convinced the Turkish government that this is an embarrassment for Turkey to do this to the Armenian church. And I should say that the restoration of the Suk Giragos had won the highest award in European Union as the best restoration of heritage buildings. So the new government in Turkey finally got convinced that it shouldn't be left like this. Now, with their own funds, they have started reconstructing or undoing the damage that their soldiers did in the church. So the reconstruction is now ongoing since April, and hopefully in a year or so the church will also be reopened. Now, a few examples from how Armenians are dealt with in Turkey. You know that Bosphorus is the most beautiful part of Istanbul, and what makes Bosphorus even more beautiful are the excellent, magnificent buildings on both sides of the Bosphorus, on the Asian side and the European side. There are palaces, mosques, private residences, schools, and most of these magnificent architectural masterpieces are built by an Armenian family called Balyan. So this family, over several generations, they were the royal architects, and they built these things. However, until 2000, if you hire a Turkish official guide to see these buildings, you will be told that these buildings are built by the Italian Bagliani architect. So after 2000, finally, they are now acknowledging that these buildings are built by the Armenian Balyan family. I have a personal incident in Bosphorus, I went to an American college called Robert College in Turkey and in Istanbul. And they organize annual swim races from the Asian side of Bosphorus to the European side. So I also participated in this race. The director of athleticism in this school was a gentleman called Abbas Sakarya, who is a very well-known and respected gymnast, wrestling person. He has won gold medals for Turkey. He has brought gymnastics to Turkey for the first time. Very prominent sportsman and very strict. He never smiles. Very highly disciplined person. And I was lucky enough in the race to come in third among the high school students. And this gentleman came to me and he congratulated me and he whispered a word in my ear, Abris. Abris means in Armenian, as you know, well done or something like that. At that time I didn't give importance to this. I thought he knows I'm Armenian, he knows this word, that's why he called Abris. 45 years later, when he was around 93 years old, he came out and said that he's an Armenian orphan from Bursa. And soon after, he died. This is that gentleman. Now, about my own family. I didn't know anything about genocide or our own family history until I was 17 years old. In our family, this was never spoken. In school, the history books don't tell about this. There is an internet. So I didn't know anything about this. As I said, in this American college, there was a competition that the winner would go to US for 1 semester as exchange student. So in the last round, 3 of us will be interviewed and the winner will go to the States for one term. The Turkish teacher asked me, if you go to US and they tell lies about Armenians being killed by Turks in 1915, what would you say? And I said, I will tell them what I learned in my history books. Anyways, I came home that night and asked my grandmother, what's going on in our family? Like, what is this? Nobody has talked. And my grandmother explained for the first time that she was pregnant during 1915 when the order came in Bursa to be deported. Bursa is about an hour and a half away from Istanbul. And her husband, being a pharmacist, she was also in the Ottoman army. So she had to start walking in the deportation convoy from Bursa with a lot of other people. And near Konya in central Anatolia, she gave birth to a boy. But under those circumstances, no milk coming from the mother, she's thirsty, hungry, and the baby doesn't last 8-9 days, and then the baby dies. So she placed the baby under a rock, and with the soldiers prodding her with the guns, she walked all the way to Damascus. And somehow, miraculously, she survived all 3 years during the war, and in 1919, she found her way back to Bursa from Damascus. But her house was taken over by Turkish or Muslim immigrants, and she couldn't even enter her own house, and they gave her a big beating. Perhaps they even assaulted her, and she found her way back to Istanbul, to the church, and that's how she survived. When I heard this, that was a dramatic event, and that's how I decided to continue to come to Canada to continue my education, and I stayed here and I married my wife. But my parents continued staying in Turkey, saying that they are too old, they cannot come to Canada. And in order to take care of them, military service is compulsory in Turkey for Turkish citizens. So in order to have the right to visit my parents and take care of them in their old age, I went into the Turkish army after I married, after I had my son. So why I'm telling you this, because when serving in the army during the day, we are marching under the hot sun, and in the evening, when you think you will rest, they start these brainwashing conferences. And professors are brought in to explain who are the enemies of Turkey. And people say Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Greece, Iran, Iraq, Syria, all the neighbors are enemies of Turkey. But the professor would say, no, the biggest enemy of Turkey are the Armenians. They have massacred Turks in 1915. They have stabbed us in the back, and now they are trying to get our diplomats. So they would tell this regularly to the soldiers. And after these conferences, other fellow soldiers would come to me and say, we know these are lies. Our village is all Armenian before, we know that. We are living in an Armenian house, left from an Armenian family. They would say, oh, my grandmother is Armenian, or my grandfather is Armenian. So all these lies people knew but didn't talk about them. That's me as a soldier. So this hidden Armenian subject is an old subject, but it's a new reality that they are coming out as Armenians. Genocide, as we know, is the destruction of the oppressed people by the oppressor state. But this is the biggest difference between Armenian genocide and the Jewish Holocaust. In the case of Jewish Holocaust, Hitler never allowed Jews to be mixed with the superior Aryan race. But in Turkey, the government leaders, they encouraged the assimilation and use of Armenian orphans into Turkish race. And Cemal Pasha, one of the three leaders, even said that Armenians are a smart, intellectual people. It will help the Turkish nation to have Armenian blood mixed with them. So the second bullet is genocide is also construction of the oppressor state and people. So what we are now trying to do with Project Rebirth and these hidden Armenians coming out is we are trying to reconstruct again the lost race, the oppressed people. I wrote this book for two reasons. In conclusion, I want to ask these two questions to you. We may not have the answers, but as this hidden Armenian subject is a new reality, we have to accept that other than Armenia, diaspora, Artsakh, Karabakh, we have this fourth new group of people called hidden Armenians in large numbers. And I wanted you to ask these two questions. who is an Armenian? In order to be Armenian, do you need to have Armenian parents? Do you need to be Christian? Do you need to be Armenian parents and Christian in order to be called Armenian? So this is one group of questions which I may have my own answers, but we should all think about these things. And the second, even more important question, who decides who is an Armenian? Is it the Armenian government? Is it the Armenian church? Is it in Echmiadzin or Antilyas? Or is it the Istanbul Patriarchate? Or is it community leaders where we are? Who decides if somebody comes and says, I know I am Armenian, my grandparents, I want to return to Armenian world. So who decides? So these are the questions that I had in mind, and we hopefully will find answers soon. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you.
Raffi, thank you very much. That was amazing. It's a topic that I think is a fairly new topic for all of us and a lot to consider. As you were talking about hidden Armenians, this is very direct hidden Armenians in Turkey, but we can think of the second, third, fourth generation of American Armenians who we've lost. In a way, they're hidden as well. This is much more dire, but from a reflective sense, there are hidden Armenians amongst us as well.
Absolutely right.
So, I want to open it up for a couple of questions. Yes?
You mentioned that we had 1,000 orphans during the massacre time. They were 7, 8, or 10 years old, whatever. And they were Muslimized. Kazım Pasha, Karabekir, and they made them as a Turkish soldier or Ottoman soldier. At that time, the Turkish Kazım Karabekir. I wonder, among those, even they sent the academy and the military academy. I wonder, anybody among those and orphans become officers, yüzbaşı, binbaşı, albay, yarbay, in that level, that knowingly or unknowingly become the officer in the Turkish army.
We don't have real
Evidence.
concrete evidence, but we know that there are generals among these people who had Armenian roots. And it's even said that, as I said, it's not written in books, but it's word of mouth, that the 1960 revolution, 27 May 1960 revolution in Turkey, when they hang the Prime Minister Adnan Menderes, those army coup soldiers, some of them were from these orphans that Kazım Karabekir trained.
Anyone else?
Yes.
It seems like you were able to get a lot, when you were in Turkey, you were able to get a lot done with regards to, the church, and with regards to just bringing people forward to, admit that they have some Armenian ancestry, in their blood. How were you able to do that without, how were you able to do that in general, given the current state of affairs in Turkey, the current government in Turkey, and how were you able to even provide, take trips back to Hayastan directly from Turkey with people who are obviously Turkish national, or at least Turkish citizens?
Yeah, until 2015, everything was okay. And until 2015, as I said, I could go back to Turkey and get in touch with these people and take them to Armenia on these trips. But since 2015, unfortunately, things are on hold. And these people are back into hiding again. And they are in touch with one another and with me through internet. But these trips are now not taking place since 2015, this big oppression that came from the Turkish government. And, so before that, it was possible, and the Turkish government was not having any big problems with us. But now it has been stopped, but thank God that we had this network established, and these people are helping one another now. Thousands of people, they have been relocated thanks to knowing each other. They're coming to Istanbul, they're coming to areas which is more peaceful. They're finding jobs, most of them have lost their jobs, etc. So this network is helping them to survive.
A follow-up question, do they have, they have each other, but do they have like real legal or political representation?
No, no, they don't. But there are lawyers among them, there are from all walks of life. Even in Turkish politics now, there are hidden Armenians. And it's better that they stay hidden, because once they are exposed, then they lose their influence or their connections. So there are hidden Armenians in quite a few influential places as well, and cooperation is happening right now.
Raffi?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Could you please comment on Sabiha Hanım Gökçen
Yes,
and Hagop Dilachar
yes.
and even Mr. Erdogan's ancestry?
Yeah, I don't know about Mr. Erdogan's ancestry, but the lady asked if I can say a few words about Sabiha Gökçen. Sabiha Gökçen is Atatürk's adopted daughter. And she was raised as the first military pilot in Turkey, and she flew military planes. And Hrant Dink, you know Hrant Dink, he found out that Sabiha Gökçen is one of the Armenian orphans from the genocide. And he found proof of this. He found relatives of Sabiha Gökçen in Lebanon. And that her real name is Hatun Sebilciyan. And when he wrote about this in Turkey, there was a huge backlash against